Hello everyone, welcome back to another lesson. And in this lesson, we're going to study a bit about one of the most important topics in QRadar, which is the core services and the impact of restarting services. Now, why this is important is because during your administration tasks, sometimes you have services that are going to stop working. So when you restart and troubleshoot them, you have to understand which service is responsible for what kind of functions and what happens when you restart the service. So IBM, they have a page about this. I'm going to link it as well in the description. So let's dive right in and take a look at the table here. So I'm not going to cover all of the services here, just the most important ones. So let's start with the accumulator. And accumulator is responsible for counting, right? In order to generate the time series graphs in the QRadar user interface in reasonable time, the accumulator creates by minute, by hour, and by day counts of data within the system for quickly populating these time series graphs. And in this tab, you can see that if that service runs only on the console, or also on managed hosts. So a managed host is basically another instance of an event processor or event collector that you have assigned to a different tenant. So we can see that for the accumulator service, it runs also on the console and on your managed hosts. And the impact of restarting the service is the aggregate data, reports, and searches. Meaning, if the service is down, you cannot generate reports, you cannot aggregate data, and you cannot generate searches. So this is the first important service I want to talk about. And the next one is the Ariel proxy server, which is responsible for proxying search requests from different processes to the various Ariel query servers. After the results are returned from the query servers, Ariel proxy can transform and aggregate data into various orderings and store into server-side cursors for later processing and retrieval. And that service, the proxy server, runs only on the console, right? And the impact is all requests to manage host for data from searches would stop until the service restarts, okay? So this basically means if the service is down and you are using the QRadar to search another managed host, like another tenant or something like this, it would not work because the server cannot proxy the request to that managed host. So this is a very important service as well. The next one is the query server itself. And the Ariel query server is responsible for reading the Ariel database on the managed hosts and send the data matching the request back to the proxy server for further processing. And this runs only on the managed host, right? The impact, all searches of the Ariel database would stop on the managed hosts. So these two services, the proxy server and the query server, they kind of go hand in hand. If one of them is down, you can't really do searching the way it should be. So those two, very important for your searching as well. The next one would be Docker, and Docker is responsible for deploying and managing a containerized application. It runs on the console and the app host. And as we talked about in previous videos, the app host is the appliance that is responsible for your applications, and it stores all the application containers and data in it. And the impact is that all applications stop working while the service is restarted. Also, data collected by applications is lost during restart. And the next important one of the main core services of QRadar is the ECS EC ingress, right? Event collection service, event collector ingress. This basically collects events in a buffer, while ECS EC and ECS EP, which we're going to talk in a few seconds here, are being restarted. Then it spools the data back to ECS EC and ECS EP. So this is like the buffer for when the collection services are stopped. It's gonna bucket everything in the service, and when the main services are back up, it's gonna send the bucket to them as well. So this runs on both console and the managed hosts. And when the service is stopped, would not allow events to be collected in a buffer and spooled to the other ECS services, right? So the next important one is ECS EC, which is the Event Collection Service, Event Collector. This is responsible for parsing, normalizing, and coalescing the events, runs on console and managed hosts. And the impact is to parsing and normalizing events, and flows would stop. Okay, so this is your event collection service. This is what collects the logs from and parse, normalize, and coalesce the logs from the different endpoints and application that you collect. And the next one is ECS EP, which is the event processor service. This correlates events from the custom rule engine, stores event in the aerial database, and forwards event matching rules within CRE to the magistrate component. So the magistrate component is basically our user interface. So the ECS EP gets the logs from the ECS EC. It runs rules on those logs, and if anything matches, it sends them to the user interface. And this obviously runs on the console and managed hosts, and the impact is for correlation, parsing, and event storage. So very, very important service. If it's down, your rules are not going to run. The next one would be host context, right? This is a long one. So the host context runs on each appliance in the deployment, right? It runs the process manager component that is responsible for starting, stopping, and verifying the status for each component within the deployment. It is responsible for the packaging and download of our database replication bundles. It's responsible for requesting, downloading, unpacking, and notifying other components within an appliance of updated configuration files. Responsible for monitoring PostgreSQL transactions and restarting any process that exceeds the predetermined time limit. So basically, the host context is like the motherboard of the services. It's responsible of managing them, making sure that everything is okay. It's probably one of the most important services as well. It runs on the console and managed hosts, and host context is the manager for all other services except ECS ingress, because this is our backup bucket service. All services controlled by host context would be inactive until they restarted. So this basically control most of the other services, very, very important. The next one would be host services. Host services runs on an ongoing daemon. It keeps track of two other running processes, which are the IMQ, which opens up communication ports between QRadar and the PostgreSQL. Runs on console and managed hosts. And the impact is that the database stops working, as well as IMQ. This also impact host context and Tomcat. And the next important service is Tomcat. Tomcat is basically a web container used to hold our user interface and web services RPC calls. It runs only on the console, and if the Tomcat service is not working, your user interface would not be available. So this was a very brief overview of the most important QRadar services. And the reason I'm doing this is because we will be working with these services in our troubleshooting modules to see what happens when the service is down, how to fix it, how to troubleshoot the logs, and how to do our best to bring it up back online. And in order to do that, we need to get ourselves familiar with the core services of QRadar. But again, the more you work with those kind of things, the more you would know what to do. It's not expected, of course, to remember everything by heart. Although if you do work a long time with QRadar, you will remember everything here, because you you work with those services almost on a daily basis in your administration and troubleshooting efforts. But for this current part of the course, this amount of knowledge is going to be enough until we dive more deeply into the console side of the QRadar deployment. And then we will be able to see how to interact with the services from the command line, right, from Linux commands, systemctl, if you have some Linux background. And we will be also able to create alerts when the services are down, which is very, very important, because sometimes the service can go down and you want to know about it immediately in order to not have any downtime for your deployment. So that would be it for now, and I will see you guys in the next section.